Hey, before this video gets started, do you guys want to hear the most British sentence ever spoken?
Back home, in London, there's a park bench near Westminster. After we do this, when we get back, I'll take you there, and together, we'll watch the sunrise over the Thames.
Conventional knowledge would dictate there is no possible way that a game as short as Dark Void, which features an entire 6 hours of gameplay, would be able to inspire a video this long. But when you're playing Dark Void, your brain turns into a slug-like goo and your perception of time slows to a crawl. So while this says 6 hours of footage, I'm almost positive I played this game for 2 months. Dark Void is bad. But to fully understand how badly this game missed the mark, I need to give you a little bit of history behind the time period this game released. In 2005, Resident Evil 4 came out, and basically laid the foundation for the next decade of third-person shooters. Then in 2006, we had Gears of War, which solidified the idea of the waist-high wall cover shooter. Then, in 2007, we had Uncharted, which took everything those last two games did and managed to spray a hot, thick, character-driven storyline all over the two of them. Obviously, some other games came out during those 2 years, but these three were particularly influential over the next few years. Fast forward to 2010, and we get Dark Void. Dark Void was the first game by the now-defunct developer Airtight Games, and it was an ambitious attempt to do what Uncharted did, but with a jetpack. Try to keep this history lesson in the back of your head for context for the rest of the video, and you should understand this game's missteps a little better. Now that we have that out of the way, let's start with the story, because I'm pretty sure this is going to be the funniest part of the script, and I need to hook the audience, because if I can trick you into sinking enough time into the beginning of the video, hopefully your eyes will glaze over and you'll accidentally watch the whole thing. Dark Void's plot basically boils down to a World War II era pilot and his navigator ex-girlfriend getting sucked into a different dimension while flying through the Bermuda Triangle, where hijinks ensue. The story borrows a lot from modern mythologies, like the ancient aliens theory, the reptilian conspiracy, the Bermuda Triangle legend, and some spicy Nikola Tesla lore. This sounds incredible, especially when you consider all that shit I said about jetpacks earlier, but sadly this game's story plays out less like the coolest X-Files episode ever, and more like the writers read the Wikipedia page for World War II, and then the episode descriptions for every episode of Season 1 of Ancient Aliens, and thought, yeah, we can turn this into a complex character-driven story. First off, the pacing is insane. Second, there's a shitload of plot threads that just flat out stop. And third, it's very obvious that this game's storyline was cut down to about an eighth of what it originally was going to be. This all creates such a mess, I have no idea where to even start. I suppose we should start from the beginning. This is how the game opens. No cutscenes, no bullshit, straight into the action. This is great. This game is supposed to be about jetpacks, and here we are, a guy with a jetpack. So far, so good. We get a nice tutorial mission with low stakes, so we can take our time to learn the controls and figure out how the game works. Then, just as you're getting used to what's going on, this character dies. We cut to 1938, and then we get introduced to the real main characters of the game, and that last guy is literally never mentioned again. After this, you have to wait for about 2 hours of gameplay before you can finally use a fully fledged jetpack again. This is an extremely awkward way to open up the main plot of the game. Why would you open with a jetpack tutorial and then cut to what basically amounts to a second ground combat tutorial instead of opening with the ground combat tutorial and then leading into the jetpack, which is obviously superior? I think the idea here was to pull the old Metroid trick where you start with the cool abilities and then they're taken away from you and you need to progress to get them back. But that would require Dark Void to be mechanically interesting in some way. You can't give me jetpack shoot game and then force me to play the most generic third-person shooter of all time for 2 hours until I can jetpack shoot game again. There's also nothing to build any level of excitement for the jetpack's return. You just progress through a couple linear levels and then arbitrarily gain access to it again.
Ah, crap. We've been at this all night. Tavi, what is that?
What?
Right there?
That's not safe. Experimental. Very dangerous.
Yeah, I know, but can it fly?
It would have made much more sense to just get rid of that entire opening sequence, start off with the first cutscene, go into the ground combat tutorial, and then have some sort of plot sequence that led up to you getting the jetpack again in the first hour or so of gameplay, followed by the jetpack tutorial. Usually I'm not the kind of guy that likes to waste time talking about what a game could have done, because there are an infinite amount of things any game could have done, and it doesn't really add anything to the review, but the pacing of the first 2 hours of this game just seems insane to me. Okay, so you've slogged through the first third of the game. Now what? Well, now you, Jetpack Brendan Fraser, and your navigator, whose entire personality boils down to the girl, join Nikola Tesla's resistance army to fight the reptilian menace in the Bermuda Triangle dimension. I'm not going to do a beat by beat of the story, but I will try to highlight some examples of how disastrous it is. The first thing you need to understand about Dark Void is that it's very, very obviously an unfinished game. The story is very clearly a larger narrative hacked down into a barely recognizable series of cutscenes with strange cuts and pacing. Let's walk through the scene where we first meet Nikola Tesla.
Hello? Hey! Hello?
It's dark in here.
One comes bearing the gift of light, and the people grow impatient. So, Taffy, I see you've brought guests.
I found them in the village. Their plane crashed.
Is that so?
So we aren't off to the worst start. Some of the dialogue is a little awkward, and that first cut is in sort of an odd spot, but let's keep watching.
The device back there, it generates electricity.
Local conditions are unique, to say the least.
Long way from Colorado Springs.
You say your plane crashed. Evidently a common occurrence around here.
Then you'll notice this cut is pretty much mid-sentence. I don't know what else was supposed to go on in this scene, but clearly something's missing. This is even more obvious after we cut back in, and the characters are in a completely different location, having a completely different conversation about what they need to do to fix their plane.
Crankshaft? Intake manifold?
The back canyon is littered with wreckage.
Anything we can salvage?
Certainly. But they have the area sealed off.
Well, you play the card you're dealt.
I imagine you do. And one hand washes the other. Come.
Here you'll notice this scene ends with the characters walking back into the cave, and then after the cut, they're outside of the cave. They're also putting on jetpacks, which weren't mentioned at all prior to this scene.
This should help you negotiate the canyon.
Pretty much every major cutscene is this poorly edited, and it reeks of massive cuts to the story. It might seem like I'm being a little bit too nitpicky here, but trust me, it all adds up over the course of the game. But that's not all. Let's talk about those dropped plot threads I mentioned earlier. This girl is called the Imperator and can tell the future or some shit. This is never expanded on, and she's only on screen once in the entire game. This character, who is the leader of the resistance fighting the reptilians, at one point says, "Hey, I'm giving you this crazy alien helmet that makes you look like Iron Man. It's a big deal." This helmet does literally nothing and has no impact on gameplay or the story, but it's very obvious that it was supposed to, otherwise they wouldn't have wasted time devoting an entire cutscene to it. This scene shows a reptilian shapeshifting into Tesla and killing him, and then later, this random lady shows up and says this.
Tesla's dead.
What?
That's not possible.
And the shapeshifter that was obviously going to take the place of Tesla is literally never seen or mentioned again, and it's very clear that the writers planned a story arc with an imposter Tesla, and that arc got completely cut. Over the course of the entire game, the story keeps talking about people who are called adepts and implies Jetpack Brendan is one.
They called you an adept.
Will, we are all born with something extraordinary inside us, but few are ready to put it to use.
Is there a course you can take?
Tell me something. Have you asked yourself how it is you're able to do the things you do?
Hell, I just try to stay out of my own way.
It's never fully explained what the fuck that means, and we're left to assume it's just an excuse for why he can absorb hundreds of alien lasers and punch robots with his bare hands. And of course, if I wanted to be pedantic, I could list dozens of smaller missteps and plot holes. Like, for example, why are there so many scenes where I'm supposed to think these characters are at risk of falling to their death, even though they're wearing a machine on their back specifically designed to prevent them from falling to their death? Why do these two characters keep talking about their recent breakup even though they were just given fully functional jetpacks?
So, Ava, with us, what happened there at the end?
Don't you remember? You had a commitment issue.
Listen, dude, me and my ex-girlfriends definitely have some differences, but I know we can put them aside for jetpacks. But by far my favorite plot hole is at the end of the game when it's revealed that the reptilians in this dimension are helping the Nazis in the Earth dimension. It's also revealed that the reptilians are supplying them with weapons, but not like cool future weapons, just shitty World War II era planes and tanks. Imagine for a second that you're Hitler, and this interdimensional being comes down from the sky in a flying saucer and says, "Listen here, Adolf. We really like this whole Jewish question thing you've got going on down here, and we want to help you win this war, buddy. Here are some weapons." And then they slowly open up an alien garage door full of laser guns and flying mech suits, and then the reptilian walks over and just starts pushing all that shit out of the way like it's a Sunny D commercial and hands you the keys to a fucking biplane. I don't want to dwell on goofy plot holes for long, but by now I'm sure you get the point. The story was probably poorly written to begin with, and it's very obvious that at some point during the development, it became necessary to take a hatchet to the plot because there wasn't going to be enough time to actually finish the game. It's a disaster. For now, I'm going to move on to the other aspect of the story that bothered me, which is the poor implementation of the mythology that inspired it. Like I said before, this game borrows a lot from Ancient Aliens theory, the reptilian conspiracy, the Bermuda Triangle legend, and lots of stuff about Nikola Tesla. Unfortunately, the story was chopped to so many pieces that it ends up being a surface-level implementation of all of this, which feels pointlessly shallow to the average player, and infuriating to somebody like me who is actually really familiar with the modern mythos surrounding all of this. The ruins in this world are clearly inspired by South American ruins. Ancient South America is very important to the Ancient Aliens mythos, but this is never really expanded on. We even get this scene of a series of wall carvings that are a very obvious reference to a Mayan carving called King Pakal's Journey to the Underworld, which is believed by Ancient Aliens theorists to be a depiction of King Pakal piloting a spaceship. The design of the reptilian UFOs is also a great homage to Ancient Aliens theory. You'll notice this ship is two concentric rings. This is a reference to Ezekiel's wheel in the Bible, which is described as being wheels within wheels, and has long been thought by Ancient Aliens theorists to be a description of an alien UFO during ancient times. It's really cool that someone on the dev team wanted to include something that specific, but it's just an elbow nudge to nerds like me, and isn't something the average person would ever notice, unless the story elaborated on it a little bit. Probably even more subtle is this enemy type, which is a flying mech the reptilians use that is in the shape of a serpent, which I'm assuming, based on the metric shitload of South American imagery, is supposed to be a stand-in for the serpent god Quetzalcoatl, who also makes an appearance in Ancient Aliens theory. We also get scenes of the reptilians doing reptilian shit, like replacing the French Prime Minister with an imposter, but all we get regarding that is a single line of dialogue. There are pieces of an amazing story here, incorporating all of these myths into one super myth, but so much of the story was left on the cutting room floor that it just ends up being pieces. Maybe I'm a dumbass on this one, and the game's collectible journals flesh out some of this stuff, but I'm going to go out on a limb here and say not only do they almost for sure not, but not a single human being has ever bothered to even check. That being said, if you want a good example of a game implementing multiple mythologies into one story, check out my Agony video. Now, you might be thinking, if the story was cut, then surely the devs must have spent all the time they saved making the game good. Well, if they would have been developing one game instead of two, that might have been the case. Let me explain. Dark Void has two components that are more or less two different games. You have jetpack sequences, and you have ground combat sequences. In the first few hours of the game, you explore some areas like this one, where the level design is handled in such a way that you can freely jetpack around, and then land and go into standard combat for small sections before flying off again. This is a really good concept. The idea of big open-ended levels where you alternate between flying and run and gun combat is absolutely fire emoji. It might even be in upwards of 3 fire emojis. Unfortunately, once you get to this ruins level, that idea totally breaks down, and from this point on, the overwhelming majority of levels are either flight levels or ground levels. You can always use the jetpack if you want, but areas are usually designed to prevent this. I'm pretty sure what happened here is that designing the type of open-ended levels that I mentioned earlier became too much trouble, and the devs needed to split the game up into more linear maps that leaned heavily either towards one playstyle or the other. It probably would have been a much smarter idea to just focus on jetpack sequences because they're significantly more interesting from a gameplay perspective. This goes back to the age-old advice I give in almost all of my videos. If you're developing a game and you want to include 2 different mechanics or sets of mechanics, you're almost always better off just sticking to one instead of going forward and more than likely doing a half-assed job on both. Let's take a closer look at the flight sequences. The levels where the jetpack takes center stage are by far the best, and it's by a massive margin. Movement while flying is probably the only good thing this game does. It's clear this was developed early and polished. Flight controls feel smooth, you've got some cool maneuvers and rotations you can pull off while firing, and anytime you get a glimmer of hope that you might be having fun while playing Dark Void, it's almost for sure going to be pulling off a cool dogfight move and gunning down a UFO. You might actually do this a lot, considering that the UFO is basically the only enemy type. Needless to say, constantly fighting one enemy is incredibly boring. And these sections drag on for way too long. Also, the bosses are terrible, if you could even call them that in the first place. This battleship fight was one of the most poorly designed and frustrating areas in the game. After you shoot all these stupid turrets, you need to land on the ship and disable it, but good luck landing because the game's physics have about a 50% chance of shattering your skeleton on the outside of the ship first. You would think that the ability to hijack enemy vehicles would add something to the game, but eventually you get extremely tired of doing this stupid QTE sequence that happens every time you do it, and it feels like a waste of time, especially since there's nothing the UFO can do that you can't do in your jetpack. And maybe if there had been more than one enemy vehicle to hijack, this would have been fun. But there was one section of the game where its air combat actually shined, and that's during literally the last boss. The final boss is this crazy dragon mech that shoots big Dragon Ball Z energy balls at you and shit. Look at this. You actually need to use your evasive moves. It's satisfying, it's cool to look at. The entire game should have been like this. And if they had actually implemented enemies, it probably would have. After 6 hours of slamming my face into my desk out of pure boredom, I was actually engaged by this fight for the first time in the entire game. So basically, other than the last 3 minutes, the jetpack combat is a boring slog that I wouldn't recommend. And since I said that's the best part of the game, you're probably hotly anticipating the next section where we talk about the even more mind-numbing ground combat. If you like boring weapons, boring sound design, shooting the same robot over and over, and comically broken melee animations, then you're going to love this state-of-the-art cover shooter. Enemy variety suffers the same problem as the air combat sequences. It's just one robot. Sometimes they look a little fancier and have a little bit more health, but don't be fooled. It's the same thing. Sometimes a big snake man shows up and wastes everyone's fucking time, and sometimes you kick snakes in the face, but this is few and far between, and the reality of the situation is a never-ending cosmic expanse of the same goddamn robot. All of the weapons are poorly designed, and it always feels like it takes just a little bit too long to kill every enemy. I also don't know what this rifle is supposed to be. Why is it so big?
Know how to handle that?
What do you think?
Fair enough.
Eventually you get this weird magnet gun that one-shots everything and is really overpowered, but even this pales in comparison to your mightiest weapon. Eventually, you will come to the conclusion that just punching your way through enemies is usually the easiest way forward, especially when you enter these vertical sections. By the way, just as a side note, these vertical sections were basically an attempt to make cover shooting more interesting by turning it sideways. This is basically the game design equivalent of that scene from SpongeBob where they push Bikini Bottom somewhere else. Honestly, this game would have been better if it just never included weapons in the first place. Here is some footage of an old Let's Play series I did where me and my friend realized that in real time.
This game's stupid.
Like, they spent so much time working on these dumb shooting mechanics. And it's like 100 times more effective to just fucking like...
Oh, sick.
To just fucking punch them. Like, this game would have been so much more fun if they just didn't include the guns at all and you're just jetpacking around fist fighting shit like a lunatic. Like, everything is the same. Like, all the robots have guns. And, like, later on when you're fighting, like, their airships and stuff, like, all that shit is normal. But the only difference is that you just don't have guns and have to punch everything. Like, I just took this game from, like, a 4 out of 10 to, like, at least a 7 out of 10. I also have some smaller mechanical gripes about these sections. Like, for example, before a level you can choose a loadout of 2 of your unlocked weapons. Usually when you're choosing a loadout in a game, it's for strategy reasons, but you have absolutely zero idea what a level is going to look like before you load into it, and even if you did, it's all the same robot anyway. How exactly am I strategizing? Just let me use everything I've unlocked. Why is this even an option? Secondly, there are upgrades for your weapons, which are all pointless. They basically just amount to unlocking more damage. Wow, dude, my Ford FM16 is red now. Sick. When you start getting into the weeds on some of these smaller mechanics, the feature creep really starts to be obvious. Just from a logistics perspective, you probably aren't going to be able to pull off developing jetpack aerial combat, standard cover shooter combat, vertical cover shooter combat, and an in-depth weapon customization system, and a narratively driven adventure game all in the same game unless you're a very experienced large studio. This is just too much shit. Dark Void's Achilles heel was its lack of focus, and it shows more than any of its other flaws. The last thing I want to cover with Dark Void is its art style. You've probably noticed the art style was very odd. It's like a halfway point between cartoon stylization and realism. I'm not sure what happened here. I don't know if there was an art director that couldn't make up their mind, or maybe a combination of limited technology and a limited talent pool made going one way or the other impossible, but it's weird. Look at this gun. I cannot stress this enough. Animations are all odd, especially the walk cycles. This lady looks like she belongs in the fucking Patterson-Gimlin footage. The color palette is also the typical boring, washed-out grays and browns that were typical of the period of time this game was released. The game just looks as boring as it plays, and it's a damn shame. My final score for Dark Void is a why did I waste my time making this video when there are so many good new releases coming out all the time? This video is going to get no views. What the fuck am I even doing with this YouTube channel, or my life for that matter, out of 10? Wait, it says here that Brad Pitt was going to make a movie out of this? That fucking rules. I changed my mind. Dark Void is awesome. Buy it for full price on Steam.com. If you want to see more videos like this one, consider subscribing. You should also follow me on Twitter so you don't miss any important updates. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.